Sarah Williams stepped into Silverstone Hospital, one of the city's top medical institutions, with high expectations. She knew she would face many challenges, but she never imagined that the battle she had to fight would start with seemingly insignificant things. Things that few people noticed but could destroy a person without the strength to endure them. She was a young, talented, and passionate nurse with a dream of helping patients and improving the hospital. But on her very first day, Sarah sensed an unfamiliar atmosphere lingering in the air, a cold, murky tension, punctuated by sharp glances from her colleagues. Those looks seemed to say she didn't belong here. Silverstone Hospital was renowned for its skilled doctors, state-of-the-art equipment, and a patient care system considered among the best. But beneath that polished exterior lay a shadowy web of unspoken rules and relationships. Sarah quickly realized that the hospital's reputation wasn't just built on expertise. It was also shaped by these hidden dynamics. As a black nurse, she wasn't the only one facing discrimination, but among the new hires, she was the only one from a minority ethnic group. That fact alone made a significant difference. From the moment she stepped into the reception area, Sarah felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. Quick glances, curt nods, she felt like an outsider. She tried to ignore it, but the weight of those silent judgments pressed down on her. When she reached her assigned department, a group of nurses was already there. No one greeted her. They stood still, each occupied with their tasks, but their eyes never stopped following her. Sarah felt scrutinized, not because she had done anything wrong, but simply because she was different. As Sarah familiarized herself with her duties, the differences between her and her colleagues became even more apparent. Subtle yet telling actions, like when a white nurse glanced at her but said nothing, while greeting other colleagues with warm smiles, made Sarah feel the quiet isolation creeping in. She tried to join conversations, but they would quickly fade when she approached. Awkward glances, abrupt changes in topic, it was impossible not to notice the growing distance. One day, she was assigned to change the bandages for an elderly patient. She carried out the task with the utmost care and professionalism. As she stepped out of the room, another nurse passed by and casually remarked, "Be careful, that patient belongs to Dr. Thompson. He doesn't like new people getting involved in his cases." It wasn't just a warning, it was a veiled reminder of Sarah's place in the hospital. She began to understand that her skills weren't the only thing being judged. Whether or not she had the right to be involved in important medical cases seemed to depend on the silent approval of those around her. Sarah's early days at the hospital were a series of encounters with covert discrimination. She was often assigned the easier, less demanding cases. White colleagues, whether new or experienced, were given more complex surgical cases, while she was left caring for patients already familiar with the long-standing nursing staff. She recognized the bias, but speaking up wasn't an option. Once, when she inquired about a surgical procedure, the lead doctor gave her a disapproving look and said, "You still have a lot to learn before you're ready for this." His words cut into her confidence like a knife, but Sarah refused to let them break her. Beyond the words and actions of her colleagues, there was also the suffocating silence. No outright hostility, yet no warmth or welcome either. Each day, she felt more like an outsider, and the professional demeanor she carried into the hospital seemed powerless against the quiet exclusion. She was an exceptional nurse, but there was one thing those around her couldn't accept: her skin color. Entering an environment that demanded not just professional competence, but also social acceptance and respect, Sarah found herself fighting on two fronts: against the challenges of her job and against the prejudices embedded in the system. She couldn't just be a good nurse. She had to prove that she deserved every opportunity this hospital offered, regardless of race or background. One evening, as she left work, weighed down by exhaustion both physical and emotional, Sarah received a call from her mother. She always found strength in these conversations, but this time, as soon as she heard her mother's voice, she couldn't hold back her emotions. When her mother asked about her first day, Sarah described the silence and discrimination she had faced. Her mother wasn't surprised. "My dear, this is a challenge you must face. But remember, You are never alone. Our history, the resilience of your grandmother and me, that is your strength." Her mother taught her patience, but also the importance of fighting for what she rightfully deserved. That phone call was more than just comfort, it was a reminder of her purpose. Drawing strength from her family's legacy of perseverance, Sarah realized that this job was more than just a career opportunity. It was a personal battle she could not afford to lose. She would prove that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she would stand her ground and dedicate herself fully to this hospital. Sarah's third day ended with exhaustion, not just from the workload, but from the emotional strain as well. Standing at the bus stop, watching the cars pass by, she felt the weight of the stares from her colleagues still lingering in her mind. The quiet discrimination still hovered in every interaction. But the only thing she could do was move forward, continue proving that she belonged. With unwavering determination, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of her arduous journey. Silverstone Hospital might not have accepted her right away, but she would never give up. Sarah could no longer deny that the sense of isolation was becoming more apparent as time passed. After the initial days of unease, the discrimination she faced was no longer just cold stares, but had transformed into blunt words and actions, all veiled under the guise of politeness. It wasn't outright hostility, but the kind of remarks that she could not ignore, words that, if spoken aloud, would expose the reality of a system striving to maintain its power. Every morning, Sarah walked past the staff lounge, where nurses would gather for coffee before starting their shifts. One day, she approached, intending to join the conversation like everyone else. But as soon as she stepped in, the room fell silent. The cold gazes of the other nurses swept over her like an icy wave. No one smiled or welcomed her. She tried to break the silence, greeting them with a simple question. "Good morning. Does anyone have an interesting case today?" Instead of a friendly response, she was met with avoidance. One of them, a nurse named Emily, who had worked at the hospital for years, glanced at her and said flatly, "I suppose you're not used to working here yet. We have very high standards. Not everyone finds it easy to work in this environment." Her words rang out as an unspoken declaration that no matter Sarah's talent or skills, she still hadn't reached the level required to be accepted among them. She said nothing more, forcing a strained smile before turning away, once again sinking into the weight of silence. Sarah knew that Emily's words were not just a simple reminder about work, but a subtle way of invalidating her. The high standards Emily mentioned were invisible barriers, ones that people like Sarah could never seem to cross. It wasn't just her professional abilities being judged, but also the color of her skin. Even before proving herself, she had already been labeled as not fitting in. One afternoon, while assisting a group of nurses in changing a patient's bandages, the conversation drifted toward an upcoming hospital seminar on emergency patient care. A colleague named Rachel casually remarked, "Hopefully this time, only skilled nurses will attend, not just the newcomers like her. Last time, no one knew what they were doing, they just got in the way." The words, though spoken lightly, carried an undeniable undertone of disdain. Rachel didn't look directly at Sarah when she spoke, but everyone in the room knew who she meant. Sarah was the only new nurse among them. The sense of loneliness and exclusion grew stronger than ever. Sarah knew she couldn't confront these remarks head-on. Every time she tried to speak up, it only made her difference more apparent, further reinforcing her isolation. She could only grit her teeth and stay silent, though internally she battled relentless questions. What must I do to prove that I belong? But no one had the answer, except herself, through the unwavering steps she had to keep taking. One morning, Sarah was assigned an important task, caring for an elderly patient who had just undergone a complex surgery. This was a case that typically required an experienced nurse, but Sarah, with full confidence, took it on. She worked with precision, carefully attending to every detail. Just as she finished dressing the wound and was about to leave the room, a doctor standing outside abruptly called her back. "Nurse, are you sure you did that correctly? Something doesn't seem right. Let me check." His words were not just a question about her abilities, but an assertion that, as a new nurse, she was not capable of handling things on her own. The comment hit Sarah hard, leaving her unable to hide her disappointment. Why were other colleagues, some with even less experience, not subjected to the same level of scrutiny? Sarah felt like she was living in an invisible world where every move she made was under watchful eyes, while others operated freely. She was doing her best, yet no effort seemed to be enough for recognition. On another occasion, she was criticized by a different doctor for a patient care decision she believed to be appropriate. While other nurses and doctors made decisions without question, Sarah had to explain every single action, even the simplest ones. The lead doctor on duty bluntly told her, "You need to remember that not just anyone can make decisions like that. That's why we don't let new staff work directly on major surgical cases." His words cut deep. Sarah had worked tirelessly to prove herself, to stand on equal ground with her colleagues. But no matter what she did or how well she performed, discrimination lurked in every corner. It wasn't always visible, but it was there in every word, every glance, every act of disregard. And Sarah realized that for her, this wasn't just a fight to prove her competence. It was a battle to protect herself from being crushed by these discriminatory words and the suffocating silence of a system that refused to accept her. The discrimination she faced wasn't always blatant, but it existed in every aspect of life at this hospital. She needed to find a way to not only rise above it, but to be an example for others, to show that, no matter the color of their skin, they deserved to be here. They deserved to be recognized. But Sarah wasn't one to give up easily. Her mother had taught her, "My daughter is not someone who gets defeated, and neither am I. Never let them make you feel like you've lost." Sarah knew that her fight was only just beginning. Everything seemed to continue in an endless cycle: cold stares, subtle remarks, and an invisible existence in the eyes of those around Sarah. Her workdays stretched long and weary, and with each step she took, she wondered if today would be any different from yesterday. The discrimination and unspoken words had hardened her heart over time. But all of those feelings suddenly shifted in a single moment, on a foggy morning when fate led her to an unexpected encounter. That morning, Sarah received a notice that she would be assigned to care for a special patient, someone considered a VIP at the hospital. She rarely handled complex cases, but this time it felt different. For the first time, it seemed like she was being genuinely trusted, not just temporarily placed in a role. When she arrived at the patient's room, she was slightly surprised to see him, an elderly man, yet still exuding strength and authority. He lay on the hospital bed with both hands in casts, but his sharp eyes remained observant and calculating. Sarah entered the room, greeting him softly, trying to maintain a professional demeanor in every movement. But as she interacted with the patient, she sensed something unusual in the air. He showed no concern about his injuries. Instead, he watched her closely, as if evaluating every gesture, every motion. There was an unspoken understanding in his gaze, not that of a typical patient, but of someone who had witnessed and endured much in life. After a long pause, he spoke. "Nurse, can you really do this job? Or are you just part of a system trying to hide the truth?" Sarah didn't know how to respond. His words were sharp, not just a question but a test. His voice carried a warning, a signal that he was not someone easily deceived, regardless of the circumstances. She took a deep breath, carefully answering, "I'm just doing my job, sir, and I believe I can do it well." He smiled faintly, as if he knew more than she imagined. "All right," he said. "Tell me about yourself. I've been observing the staff in this hospital for a long time, and I can see one thing. You are not ordinary. You can do far greater things than you think." These words came from a patient, an old man who seemed unremarkable aside from his injuries, yet his eyes and voice sent a chilling wind through Sarah, illuminating a part of the darkness that had always surrounded her. In the following days, he remained in his hospital bed, but instead of merely treating his wounds, Sarah found herself drawn into long conversations, discussions that extended beyond health and into larger matters of life. He didn't just ask about her work, but about her experiences in the hospital, about the struggle against discrimination. He asked if she ever felt like she was being challenged by a system she couldn't change, a system so deeply ingrained in every corner of life and work that it made people wonder if true fairness could ever exist. "Have you ever felt rejected by a system?" he asked one day, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Have you ever thought that no matter how well you do your job, because of the color of your skin, you will always be judged as less capable than others?" His question wasn't just for the sake of asking. It was an invitation to something deeper, as if he already knew the answer. Sarah remained silent, not replying immediately. She felt her heart tighten. She couldn't deny the truth in his words, that she had often asked herself the same thing. But part of her also didn't want to admit such a harsh reality. From those conversations, something within her began to change. She no longer viewed the hospital with suspicion alone. She started to recognize the fairness she had always dreamed of, but had never fully experienced. It was as if Thomas, this special patient, had opened a new door for her, a door that led not just to physical wounds, but to the hidden emotional scars, the long-lasting pain no one ever saw. One day, as Sarah was changing his bandages, she overheard voices outside his room. The usual unpleasant whispers about her presence in the hospital resurfaced. The curious gazes still lingered, waiting for her to make a mistake so they could criticize her. But as she felt that tension build, Thomas did something unexpected. He requested the head doctor and hospital administrators to come to his room for a conversation. "There's something I want you all to know," Thomas said when the doctors and management gathered around his bed. "I've been observing this discrimination for a long time, and I think it's time you do something about it. I am not just an ordinary patient. I am someone who can change the way this system operates." The head doctor and others stood in silence, unsure why a patient was making such a demand. But the determination in Thomas's eyes and the quiet presence of Sarah beside him made it impossible to ignore. And that was the turning point. Thomas's words didn't just shift the perspective of those in the room. They became the catalyst for Sarah to find her own path in this fight. He was not just a VIP patient. He was someone who could alter an entire system. His words were a call to action, one that Sarah could no longer turn away from. Sarah realized that if she wanted change, she couldn't just stand on the sidelines. She had to step into the fight, not just for herself, but for others like her. And from that moment on, the change within Sarah was no longer just about learning her profession. It was about awakening to the deeper issues in this hospital system. She could no longer remain silent. Every morning when Sarah entered the hospital, she felt a fatigue that was not only physical, but also mental. As the working days passed, she increasingly sensed the stifling atmosphere from her colleagues' eyes, the avoidance of conversations, and sometimes the blame through casual remarks. It seemed that everything in this hospital, from patient cases to important decisions, had an invisible discrimination that she couldn't deny. These actions, though small, were more painful than direct words. Sarah knew that discriminatory words could kill a person from the inside. She felt it not only from her colleagues, but also from the very people she trusted, from the top doctors she admired. They, in their pristine white coats, resplendent under the bright hospital lights, could arrogantly look down on her with disdain simply because of her skin color. Though unspoken, they always found ways to avoid contact with her, as if her presence diminished their value. One morning, as Sarah moved from one patient room to another, she encountered the head of the department, Dr. Adam, whom she had thought would be understanding and supportive. He passed her with an indifferent look and didn't even glance at her. Before she could greet him, Sarah received only a fleeting nod. But what puzzled Sarah most wasn't Dr. Adam's disrespectful attitude, but when he casually called another colleague, a white nurse, to work with him on an important case. They walked past her without noticing Sarah's presence, as if she were an invisible ghost in the hospital corridor. Sarah paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and tried to suppress the rising feeling of hurt. This hospital had taught her that sometimes you have to work twice as hard as others just to be recognized a little. But no matter how hard she worked, her skin color remained a significant obstacle. In the past, Sarah had tried to ignore these contemptuous attitudes, but now, every time she tried to approach a colleague or a patient, She felt she was never qualified to stand on equal footing with those around her. It was a lingering pain, an invisible wound that only she could feel, and whether she wanted to or not, it persisted like an unhealed scar. The discrimination came not only from the attitudes of her white colleagues, but also from the small actions in her daily work. One day, Sarah was assigned to change the dressing for an elderly patient who had just undergone a complex surgery. She came to the patient's room with all the care and sensitivity she could muster. But as she began her work, she clearly sensed the patient's unease. The patient didn't look at her with the eyes of someone needing care, but with a look of doubt, as if she wasn't capable of doing the job. When she gently asked the patient about their feelings after the surgery, he replied with a curt sentence, "Are you sure you'll do it right? Or are you just a new nurse?" These words were like a slap in Sarah's face. She had worked her hardest, but in the patient's eyes, just because she was black, she wasn't allowed to do this job confidently. And then, Sarah faced an uncomfortable discussion in a nurses' meeting. They sat around the table, discussing patient cases and assigning tasks for the next day. When it was her turn, Sarah received a request that she knew wasn't fair. "Sarah, can you help me change the dressing for the patient in room 307? A nurse said with a soft voice, but her eyes avoided Sarah. "Are you sure you can handle that?" The question wasn't about her professional ability, but a subtle mockery. All the other nurses in the room turned away, pretending to be busy with their work. Sarah realized they were trying to put her in a position they thought she could only handle. They didn't see her as a colleague, but as someone pushed aside, someone who could only do menial tasks. Every day, Sarah had to fight not only with her work but also with discrimination, indifferent glances, and unintentional but painful words. She often wondered if she was the only one feeling this exclusion. Did everyone else in the hospital see her as an outsider, a part of the system they didn't want to acknowledge? The feeling of being excluded seemed to have become an integral part of Sarah's life. But she didn't want to let it control her for too long. One afternoon, while walking down the hallway, Sarah heard whispers from the nurses' lounge. She knew they were talking about her, not because she wanted to eavesdrop, but because they didn't bother to whisper when they saw her. A nurse named Olivia said with a contemptuous tone, "She's just started, and she thinks she's someone. Does she even know what this job requires?" Olivia continued, ignoring Sarah's presence just outside the door. "She just works for the sake of it, never really understands our work." Sarah stopped, her heart heavy, but she didn't enter the room. She just quietly left, like a ghost in the shadows, letting those words sink into her mind. Every time, Sarah couldn't help but feel like an outsider. But it was from those moments that she realized that if she couldn't change them, she had to change herself. She had to be stronger, not only to protect herself, but also to prove that skin color couldn't determine a person's worth. And gradually, Sarah stopped waiting for recognition from those around her. She knew that if anything could be changed, it was her own resilience and fortitude. Discrimination might never completely disappear, but she wouldn't let it control her life. She would fight by proving her worth and ability. Sarah felt a shift from the difficult months she had endured. She was no longer a naive and hopeful new nurse, trusting in fairness. Each workday was a silent battle, a quiet struggle she faced not only with her job, but also with the deep-seated racism permeating the hospital. Despite the blatant discrimination, Sarah could only continue her work, retreating into long, weary nights, patiently waiting for an opportunity to stand up and fight. That opportunity came unexpectedly, not in the way she imagined. One late afternoon, as Sarah prepared to end her shift, she received an unusual notification. A special patient would be transferred to the hospital, and she was assigned to care for him. This was no ordinary case, but a VIP patient, someone the hospital had meticulously prepared for. Sarah didn't think much of it, but something inside her stirred. This wasn't just another case, it was a chance to prove her worth. When she entered the patient's room, Sarah was surprised by his presence, Thomas Harris. The name resonated with importance and authority in the medical field. He was an elderly man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, as if he had seen life's ups and downs. The scars on his body didn't make him look weak. Instead, they accentuated his strength. Sarah didn't just see him as a patient, but as someone with an unusual aura, an underlying power. Carefully, Sarah began examining his wounds and performing the necessary procedures. Unlike other patients, Thomas didn't lie quietly, but attentively watched her every move. He wasn't rushed or demanding, just observing her, as if trying to understand her, what she carried inside. After Sarah finished, he spoke. "You're not like the others here, are you?" It wasn't a question, but an observation. Sarah was slightly surprised. She tried to remain calm, replying cautiously, "Sir, I think I'm like everyone else in this hospital. We all have a common goal." Thomas looked at her, his eyes never leaving hers, a slight smile on his lips. "A common goal, perhaps. But I think you know that goal has never been truly fair. Have you ever felt that you're only given menial tasks, no matter how well you perform?" Sarah froze, surprised by his directness. Despite her efforts, she couldn't deny he was right. Every day, she was assigned easier tasks, less demanding cases. But she couldn't answer him directly. She just smiled awkwardly and continued her work. But Thomas's words didn't stop there. Over the next few days, he opened up to Sarah, sharing his views on the hospital system, its operations, and the issues he had noticed during his years in the medical field. "This hospital, and many others, are like a broken clock," he said. "We can work our hardest, but the internal parts still function as they were programmed. If no one dares to stand up, the clock will never run correctly." These words stirred something in Sarah, a powerful motivation she hadn't felt before. Thomas wasn't just a VIP patient. He was someone who could change the entire system. She realized this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, a chance to not only defend herself, but also fight for a fairer future for everyone like her, those marginalized because of their skin color. In the following days, Thomas helped Sarah more. He wasn't just a patient but a mentor, a supporter in a battle she couldn't fight alone. One day, while Sarah was busy and exhausted, Thomas requested a private meeting. "I can help you change your life and this hospital," he said. "But you must do one thing. Stand up and make it clear you won't remain silent in the face of discrimination." His words were like a light in the darkness, a call Sarah couldn't refuse. She realized change couldn't just be private conversations. She had to act, stand up, and do something bigger, not just for herself but for others. Everything became clearer in her mind. After that conversation, Sarah was no longer just a nurse in this hospital. She became the leader of a fight for justice. She started gathering information, recording the incidents she witnessed daily, the discriminatory dialogue she endured, things she couldn't let continue. She planned, strategized, and finally decided to act. Thomas's intervention wasn't just about helping her recognize the problem, but encouraging her to act. While the hospital continued with its old rules, Sarah prepared to launch a revolution within herself. She was no longer afraid to stand up. She knew if she didn't start the change, no one else would. And so, Sarah made the most important decision of her life to confront racism in this hospital, not just for herself but for others. Since Sarah decided to stand up against discrimination in the hospital, everything became exponentially harder. Her heart was filled not only with determination but also with anxiety, as she understood that every step she took could be a major battle. Sarah couldn't simply continue her work as before. She had decided to change things from the inside, to fight to expose everything she and her colleagues like her had endured. However, this journey was not easy. In the first days after that decision, Sarah felt like an outsider in the very environment she had once considered her place to contribute. Her colleagues no longer looked at her with indifference, but with caution, with undisguised sarcastic remarks. Those looks revealed hatred, fear, and sometimes contempt, because they knew she had dared to do what no one else had: speak up. They didn't want change, and for someone like Sarah, a new nurse, to challenge racism in her own workplace was a threat to their stability. Sarah was no longer able to stand on the sidelines. She couldn't remain silent. Every day, every shift, she faced rumors, scrutinizing eyes, and incidents that made her heart feel like it would break. One memorable moment was when she was asked to join a major surgery where the doctors and nurses had long worked together. She was assigned a part in the operation. No one said anything, but the silence in the operating room was enough for Sarah to realize that people didn't really trust her. She could feel the underlying resentment from her colleagues, who, having previously ignored her, now looked at her with cold eyes. When everyone returned to work, a minor incident occurred during the surgery, not Sarah's fault, but when the chief surgeon, Dr. Collins, looked at her, his gaze wasn't one of doubt as usual. Instead, he simply shook his head and said, "You weren't careful enough." Sarah felt frustrated, but she couldn't argue, as anything she said could be used against her. She could only remain silent, continuing her work with utmost caution. After the surgery, she was alone again, sitting in the nurse's lounge, tired and empty. It was the first time she truly felt the loneliness in her profession, with her colleagues seemingly siding with another force. In the following days, Sarah realized that she couldn't just deal with personal difficulties, but also had to face a system that had long existed with invisible rules. Her colleagues didn't speak directly, but they found ways to ostracize her, always assigning her less complex cases, tasks no one else wanted. They treated her like a temporary employee, someone not worthy of being involved in the hospital's important decisions. The discrimination wasn't always obvious, but it was the coldness that hurt Sarah the most. She wasn't just overlooked but also unacknowledged, unappreciated in an environment where she knew she could do so much better. But Sarah didn't give up. Every day, she found ways to change the situation from within. She started working quietly, proving that she wasn't just someone working for the sake of it, but someone with real ability. She continued doing menial tasks, but each time, she put her all into it, every action filled with seriousness and care. Gradually, she began to get attention from some doctors and nurses. A doctor named Dr. Mitchell, who was quite unfamiliar with Sarah, started noticing her work. One day, after a stressful shift, he called her over and said, "I have to admit, you work very well. I see you can do much more." It was an unexpected compliment, but for Sarah, it was a significant step. She knew not everyone would see her abilities immediately, but each compliment, each small recognition, was a solid brick in the change she was fighting for. But not everyone was easy to change. Once, when Sarah was assigned a more important task, another doctor, who had always been cold, suddenly asked her to redo the work she had just finished. "You didn't follow the procedure. Start over," the doctor ordered. Sarah couldn't suppress her frustration. She had done everything correctly, but why did she have to redo it for a reason she couldn't understand? In that moment, disappointment overwhelmed her, but Sarah couldn't let herself break down. She took a deep breath and carefully redid everything, though her heart was filled with resentment. Such incidents made her understand that her fight wasn't just her own, but also against a system that had long existed with injustices, with invisible rules that everyone had to follow. And then, as if by a miracle, when Sarah was ready to stand firm with what she had done, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, Thomas Harris, the special patient Sarah had cared for, asked to see her. She didn't know what to do, but when she arrived at his room, she saw him sitting on the bed, his eyes shining with a confidence she had never seen before. "Sarah, I know you've worked very hard," he said, "but I also see you're being tested too much. I can help you change everything, but you have to stand up. You can't just keep working in silence. You have to fight." Thomas didn't just say these words as a patient, but as someone with the power and ability to help her make profound changes in the hospital. That statement was like a spark in Sarah, a new motivation to not only continue her work, but also change everything from within. For the first time, she felt she was no longer alone in this fight. She knew she couldn't change everything immediately, but the first steps had been outlined. The internal struggle, with all its trials and difficulties, had officially begun, and Sarah was ready to face it all. As Sarah faced increasing challenges, she began to realize that her fight was not just a personal struggle, but a long-term strategy to change a long-standing system. Her decision to enter this battle changed not only her, but also those around her. With the quiet help of Thomas Harris, whom she had cared for, Sarah understood that changing a complex system like the hospital wasn't just about small steps but a revolution. This revolution couldn't happen overnight, but it could start with the firm steps of someone determined to make a change. She began to act strategically, knowing that if not today, she would be the one to create change in the future. The first step Sarah decided to take was to approach some influential figures in the hospital to start conversations about the changes she thought were necessary. First was Dr. Mitchell, a respected doctor in the hospital, and someone with whom Sarah felt she could build a long-term relationship. She knew he was one of the few doctors with an open mind and willing to acknowledge the hospital's problems. They had had private conversations before, but this time, Sarah wanted to address the issue directly. "Dr. Mitchell, I need your help. I want to make some changes in our working methods, especially regarding recruitment and racial discrimination in the hospital," Sarah said firmly. Dr. Mitchell looked at her, surprised but understanding. "I understand your point, Sarah, but we know it's a big problem, not solvable overnight. If you want change, you need the support of the leaders." Dr. Mitchell's words made Sarah feel like she was at a crossroads. She could remain silent and continue her work, but if she did, could change ever come? Sarah knew the answer no. Change couldn't come if she continued to ignore the problems around her. After the conversation with Dr. Mitchell, Sarah began to gather information, recording the events and conversations she had experienced during her time working. She sought to not only address racial discrimination, but also create an open working culture where everyone could integrate and contribute their best. Sarah didn't just want to solve the current problem. She wanted to change people's attitudes towards diversity at work. She understood that the issue wasn't just about being assigned easy cases, but about how the hospital perceived her, perceived everyone like her. One morning, Sarah stood in front of the hospital's meeting room, where doctors and senior managers would meet to discuss changes in procedures and operations. This was the first time Sarah stood before a large group, including those with significant power and influence over final decisions. Sarah felt a little nervous, but she knew this was her only chance to speak up and implement the changes she desired. She had prepared thoroughly, with data, surveys, and stories she and her colleagues had experienced. These weren't just empty words, but concrete evidence of discrimination and injustice in the hospital. When the meeting started, Sarah stood up, looked at those in the room, and began her presentation. "Dear doctors and managers, I would like to present an issue that I believe has existed for too long in this hospital. It's racial discrimination and subtle prejudice that I and many others face daily. This not only affects us, but also impacts the quality of patient care and ultimately harms the hospital itself." All eyes in the room were on her. No one spoke, no one interrupted, only expectant eyes. Sarah continued, "I don't want to stand here and criticize anyone, but I want everyone to understand that if we don't start now, we'll never change. We need a fairer recruitment system, a more open working environment where discrimination no longer exists." The meeting proceeded in silence, but Sarah didn't feel alone. She knew these were necessary steps. No matter how difficult, no matter how much opposition, she knew this was the right thing to do. Finally, after hours of discussion, the hospital decided to conduct an internal survey on diversity and inclusion and to develop specific plans to improve recruitment and promotion processes. The outcome of that meeting was not just a significant step for Sarah, but a victory for everyone marginalized in the hospital. She began to see change not only externally, but also within her colleagues. They no longer looked at her with contempt, but began to see her as a real colleague. Sarah's words were no longer a lonely voice in the hallway, but a message everyone had to face. However, Sarah understood that changing such a large system couldn't be accomplished in just one meeting or one day. She still had much to do. A system, a working culture, couldn't change just because a few individuals stood up but needed a community to join hands. Sarah knew this wouldn't be easy, and those hindering change were still numerous. But importantly, she had gained support from influential people, and she saw light at the end of the tunnel. In the following months, Sarah continued to work hard, but she was no longer alone. She had allies, people willing to stand with her in this fight. She began to realize that when she dared to speak up and make changes, she became part of that change. And from now on, not only Sarah but everyone like her could see that the hospital could change. Discrimination was no longer an inevitable reality, but something that could be defeated. And Sarah, with her perseverance and relentless determination, would lead this revolution from within. Sarah sat in her office, facing the stack of documents she had meticulously organized over the past several weeks. Each page contained not just numbers and statistics, but the stories of her and her colleagues, the struggles she had experienced since stepping into this hospital. These documents, the conversations she had recorded, were all evidence of what she was doing, a change not immediately visible, but a crucial stepping stone for deeper changes throughout the hospital system. It seemed that everything was falling into place, and the hospital was beginning to show signs of change. But Sarah understood that this was not the end of her journey, but part of a long-term process. She had tirelessly pushed for reforms in recruitment, fair promotion, and the building of a more open working environment. However, she knew she still had a long road ahead. Not everything had completely changed. Racial discrimination still existed in subtle forms that she couldn't immediately detect. These signs still lingered in every decision, in the eyes of those around her. But this time, Sarah was no longer a lone warrior in this fight. She had created significant momentum and had allies in her reform journey. One late afternoon, as the hospital prepared to close, Sarah happened to meet Thomas Harris in the hallway. He was still in his wheelchair, but this time his eyes were different, no longer a cold observation but the eyes of a mentor, a companion in this fight. Thomas nodded slightly, as if he recognized what Sarah had been doing. He didn't say anything immediately, but his mere presence made Sarah feel a strange surge of motivation. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Sarah, I see you've done very well. But I know you can do more. You're not just changing a hospital, you're changing a system." Those words were not just recognition but encouragement, a powerful push. Sarah had always felt uneasy facing such significant changes. But now, looking into Thomas's determined eyes, she realized that no matter how difficult, she would not give up. The awakening began when Sarah realized she was no longer alone. She was not just an employee in this hospital, but someone standing up for something bigger, someone changing how a community views fairness, diversity, and the rights of minorities. Change couldn't come with just a meeting or a board decision. Change had to start with small actions, with the decisions of each individual in the organization. And Sarah knew she was the one starting this revolution. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the hospital was less busy, Sarah entered the meeting room with thorough preparation. What she had planned for months was not just the documents she would present, but the people she had convinced, the allies in this fight. She felt like she was on a launch pad, where her decisions would not only affect a small group, but change the entire hospital culture. She could feel the tension in the air, but this time, she was no longer afraid. She was ready to face everything. Entering the meeting room, Sarah began her presentation. She presented data on racial discrimination in the hospital, internal surveys on unfair recruitment and promotion opportunities. But most importantly, she shared the real stories she and others had experienced. These stories were not just evidence of discrimination, but calls for the change she wanted to see. She didn't just propose reforms in recruitment policies, but wanted to change the very perceptions and attitudes towards diversity and inclusion in the hospital. Unexpectedly, in the moment she spoke, Sarah received support from people she thought would never side with her. One of the department heads spoke up, sharing that they also noticed the shortcomings in the system and needed a different approach. Others in the meeting room began to agree, and a discussion broke out. They no longer saw her as a new nurse, but as someone with clear views and determination to make real changes. After the meeting, Sarah received strong support from the board, and her reform plan was approved. A new diversity and inclusion strategy was outlined, and the hospital began implementing the first changes, including organizing diversity training and recognizing and rewarding the contributions of employees from minority groups. And as the hospital began to change, Sarah realized that the awakening was not just about her or the hospital, but a message she wanted to send to everyone like her that they had the right to stand up, they had the right to be recognized, and they could change everything from within. The fight didn't end here. It would continue, every day, every step, until fairness and equality were truly established. But Sarah knew that one day, looking back on her journey, she would not only see the successes achieved, but also realize that she herself had been part of a significant change. She had awakened not only herself, but also those around her and the entire hospital community. She had done what she never dared to dream of: a real reform, starting from within. Sarah's story is not just a personal journey of overcoming hardship, but also a testament to the power of resilience and determination to change. She started as an outsider, treated as a stranger in her workplace, where racial discrimination was subtle but strong. The times she was overlooked, the cold glances, and the discriminatory remarks were not just challenges, but also a weight on her shoulders. But her patience and unwavering will made her a pioneer in a reform that no one had previously dreamed of. The profound meaning of this story lies in the awakening and inner strength. Sarah not only changed herself, but became an inspiration, helping to transform an entire hospital system. Although the challenges she faced were inevitable, they paved the way for a more just and inclusive future. This story is not just a reminder of racial discrimination in the workplace, but also of the power of a fighting spirit, not only to overcome oneself, but also to fight for those around you. The first lesson this story teaches is the value of patience and persistence in a long-term battle. Sarah couldn't change everything immediately. Each step was a challenge, each workday a silent battle that no one could see except her. But she didn't give up. She knew that changes, big or small, take time to mature. This lesson is also a reminder that life is not a bed of roses. Difficulties and challenges are inevitable, and the important thing is to know how to get up after each fall. The second lesson Sarah's story conveys is the power of unity and community support. Although Sarah faced many challenges, she was not alone on this journey. She found allies, like-minded people who could stand by her in the fight against discrimination and injustice. It was through the support of those around her that she could rise and create real change. Unity is the key to bringing significant changes from thought, from each individual, into reality. This story shows that no one can change the world alone, but together we can make a difference. The third lesson is about daring to stand up and speak the truth. In a workplace filled with prejudice and discrimination, Sarah decided not to remain silent, but to speak up, even though she knew it would change her life. Silence in the face of injustice never yields results. Sarah chose to stand up and fight not only for herself, but also for others like her, those without a voice. Sometimes just one person daring to speak up is enough to create change. Others may remain silent out of fear, but when one person starts speaking, others will follow. That is the power of truth. Nothing can be hidden forever. Daring to face the truth is the only way to uncover the hidden and create lasting changes. The fourth lesson is about the importance of building a fair system. Sarah didn't just fight for personal rights, but for a better system for everyone. She understood that not only individuals needed to change, but also the system around them. She fought not only for a deserving job, but also to create a working environment where everyone had equal opportunities, regardless of skin color, gender, or background. Sarah's story shows that a fair society cannot rely solely on outstanding individuals, but also needs a system that listens and recognizes everyone's contributions. The final lesson is about the courage to face significant challenges. Sarah entered an uphill battle, but her courage helped her overcome everything. She was not the only one in the hospital facing discrimination, but she was the one who dared to confront and change it. This required not only personal courage, but also the strength of perseverance in the face of challenges, those who didn't want change, and ideas that were not easily changed in an outdated system. Despite potential setbacks, daring to move forward, daring to stand up, and daring to act is the most important thing. Sarah's story is a testament to the strength of people standing up for what is right. It teaches us that change doesn't come immediately, but it will come if we don't give up, if we persevere and do the right thing every day. This story also shows that awakening is not just about personal awareness, but also about the awakening of a community, a system. If each individual dares to stand up for the right values, one day our society will become fairer and better. Sarah not only changed herself, but also created a wave of change in the hospital, and her story is a profound reminder that wherever we are, we can make a difference if we believe in ourselves and dare to act.